The train doors opened and Maren Doyle knew she'd made a terrible mistake. She'd traveled 800 miles to marry a stranger, a man who couldn't speak, on a frontier where women like her weren't supposed to exist. The platform fell silent as she stepped down, her traveling dress dusty and wrinkled, her body drawing stares she'd spent a lifetime trying to avoid. Then Jace Calder handed her a note instead of a greeting, and the crowd waited for her to run. But what happened next changed everything. Stay with me until the end of this story. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this journey travels. The wind hit Maren like a physical blow the moment she stepped onto the platform at Tanner's Creek Station. It wasn't the gentle breeze of Philadelphia, scented with coal smoke and bakery bread. This was something else entirely, a raw, unforgiving force that seemed determined to push her back onto the train, back to the life she'd just escaped. She gripped her carpet bag tighter and forced herself to take another step. The platform was barely more than a wooden deck nailed together with hope and desperation. A dozen people clustered near the ticket office, their conversations dying the moment they saw her. Maren had learned to read those silences years ago. They always meant the same thing. Too big, too much, too different. She'd heard it in whispers at church socials, seen it in the pinched expressions of shopkeepers, felt it in every declined dance at every wedding she'd ever attended. 28 years old and still unmarried, still living in her sister's spare room, still pretending not to notice when Catherine's husband looked at her with barely concealed impatience. "You could try harder," Catherine had said just last month, her voice tight with frustration. Smaller portions at dinner. Perhaps a corset that actually... Maren had stopped listening. She'd heard it all before. The advertisement had appeared in the Philadelphia Gazette on a Tuesday morning. She'd been helping Catherine sort through the social pages when a small notice in the back caught her eye. Wanted. Woman of strong character for frontier marriage. Physical appearance unimportant. Must be willing to work. Silence valued. J. Calder, Tanner's Creek, Wyoming territory. Catherine had laughed when Maren showed it to her. Silence valued? What kind of man writes that? But Maren had read it 3 more times, her heart beating faster with each pass. Physical appearance unimportant. 4 words that seemed impossible. 4 words that might be a lie. But what if they weren't? She'd written to J. Calder that same evening. His reply had come 6 weeks later, brief and oddly formal. "We'll meet train Thursday next. Bring practical clothing. House is simple. Work is hard. Marriage is real. Decide now." And she had decided. Standing in Catherine's parlor, listening to her sister's husband complain about the cost of her room and board, Maren had decided that anything, even marrying a stranger on a frontier she'd never seen, was better than slowly disappearing in a place that had never wanted her to begin with. Now, watching the crowd on the platform stare at her with undisguised curiosity and judgment, she wondered if she'd simply traded one kind of misery for another. "That's her," someone whispered. A woman in a severe black dress, her mouth pursed like she'd bitten into something sour. "That's Calder's mail-order bride." "Good Lord," another voice added. "He didn't mention she was..." "Shh. She'll hear you." Maren's cheeks burned, but she kept her chin up. She'd learned that much, at least. Never let them see you break. A man separated from the crowd, tall, lean in the way frontier men often were, with shoulders that spoke of hard labor and a face weathered by sun and wind. He wore dusty work clothes and a hat pulled low over his eyes. He moved with an economy of motion that suggested he didn't waste energy on unnecessary things. This had to be Jace Calder. He stopped 3 feet away from her and just looked. Not with disgust or disappointment, but with a kind of careful assessment that made Maren feel like he was cataloging her strengths and weaknesses the way one might evaluate a horse at auction. She lifted her chin higher. "Mr. Calder?" He didn't answer. Instead, he reached into his shirt pocket and withdrew a small piece of paper, already folded and waiting. He held it out to her. Maren took it, her fingers trembling slightly. The crowd had gone completely silent now, everyone watching to see what would happen next. She unfolded the note. The handwriting was neat, precise. "I cannot speak. Born this way. Told you in my letter, but maybe you didn't understand. If this changes things, train returns east in 1 hour. No judgment either way. Your choice." Maren read it twice, her mind racing. "Told you in my letter." She thought back to his reply, to that strange phrase, silence valued. He hadn't been talking about what he wanted from her. He'd been warning her about himself. She looked up from the note to find him watching her, his expression carefully neutral. But there was something in his eyes, a kind of braced readiness, like a man expecting a blow he'd received too many times before. The crowd waited. Somewhere behind her, a woman whispered to her companion, "She'll get right back on that train. Who'd stay for that?" Maren had spent her entire life being the person others expected to fail. The sister who would never marry. The woman who would never be pretty enough, small enough, acceptable enough to deserve love or respect, or even basic kindness. She'd come 800 miles to escape that judgment. She wasn't about to surrender to it now. Maren met Jace's eyes directly. "Do you have a wagon, Mr. Calder, or will we be walking to your farm?" For just a second, something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile, but close. A loosening of tension around his eyes that suggested relief, or maybe respect. He gestured toward a wagon at the edge of the platform. It was simple but well-maintained, pulled by two sturdy horses that looked far better cared for than their owner. Maren picked up her carpet bag and started walking. Behind her, she heard the murmurs of disappointment from the crowd. They'd been hoping for a spectacle, for her humiliation, for confirmation that people like her and Jace didn't deserve happiness. They'd have to find their entertainment elsewhere. Jace moved ahead to take her bag, but Maren shook her head. "I can manage." He paused, then nodded and stepped back. She appreciated that. No false chivalry, no attempt to treat her like she was fragile. Just acceptance of her choice. She climbed onto the wagon seat without help, her traveling dress catching on the rough wood. Jace swung up beside her with practiced ease and took the reins. They pulled away from the station without a word. The town of Tanner's Creek sprawled along the railway line like something hastily assembled and never quite finished. Buildings leaned at odd angles. The main street was more mud than road. Signs advertised dry goods, a telegraph office, a saloon that looked like it had seen better days and worse nights. People stared as they passed. Maren kept her eyes forward. After 20 minutes of silence, the town fell away behind them, and there was nothing but open land, rolling hills covered in scrub grass, distant mountains sharp against the sky, and a sense of space so vast it made Maren's chest tight. She'd never seen anything like it. Philadelphia had been all crowds and noise and buildings pressed together like teeth in a too small mouth. This was the opposite. So much emptiness, it felt almost aggressive. Jace kept the horses moving at a steady pace. He didn't look at her, didn't try to communicate, just drove. Maren found herself studying him from the corner of her eye. He looked to be in his early 30s, though the sun damage made it hard to tell. His hands on the reins were scarred and calloused. There was a tension in the way he held himself, like a man used to being alone and not quite sure what to do with company. After another mile, she couldn't stand the silence anymore. "Your letter said the work was hard," she said. "What kind of work?" Jace kept his eyes on the road for a moment, then pulled the wagon to a stop. He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small notebook and pencil, clearly something he carried for exactly this purpose. He wrote quickly. Everything. Crops, animals, repairs, hauling water, cooking, cleaning. Frontier doesn't give you choices about what kind of work you do. You do all of it, or you starve. He handed her the notebook. Maren read it and nodded. "I've worked before. In Philadelphia, I helped run a boarding house for 2 years. Laundry, cooking for 20 people, cleaning, managing supplies. I'm not afraid of hard work." He wrote again. "Boarding house in a city is different than frontier farm. No running water, no store down the street. Closest neighbor is 4 miles. Winter lasts 6 months. You'll be isolated." "I've been isolated my whole life," Maren said quietly. "At least here, I'll be useful." Jace looked at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he wrote one more line. "You'll be more than useful. You'll be necessary. If that's not enough for you, tell me now." Maren felt something shift in her chest. Not love. She didn't know this man well enough for that, but maybe the beginning of understanding. "It's enough," she said. He nodded once, then snapped the reins and they started moving again. The sun was beginning to sink toward the horizon when Jace's farm finally came into view. It was modest even by frontier standards. A small house that looked hand-built, a barn that had seen better days, a chicken coop, and several fenced areas for animals. Everything had the worn, patched look of a place maintained by one person doing the work of three. As they approached, Marin saw a woman standing on the porch of the house. She was older, maybe 60, with iron gray hair pulled back in a severe bun and a face that suggested she'd long ago run out of patience for foolishness. Jace brought the wagon to a stop and jumped down. The woman came down the porch steps, her eyes moving from Jace to Marin with sharp assessment. "So you actually came," she said to Marin. Her voice was rough, like she'd spent years breathing dust. "Wasn't sure you would." "Most don't, once they see him." Marin climbed down from the wagon. "Most people make a lot of assumptions about what matters." The woman's eyebrows rose slightly. "Fair enough. I'm Ruth Brennan. I live about 4 miles east. Came over to make sure Jace had a decent meal ready for your arrival, since he's about as useful in a kitchen as a 3-legged dog." Jace was already pulling Marin's carpet bag from the wagon. He shot Ruth a look that managed to convey annoyance without any sound or gesture. Ruth ignored him. "House is small, but it's solid. Jace built most of it himself, which is why some of the corners aren't quite square. Roof doesn't leak much. Well, water's clean. You'll share the bedroom. He only built one, and I doubt either of you expected to be sleeping separately after traveling this far to get married." Marin felt her face heat. She hadn't let herself think too much about that particular aspect of things. "The minister's coming tomorrow morning," Ruth continued. "Jace arranged it last week. Figured you'd either be here to marry him or you wouldn't, and there was no point waiting to find out which. That work for you?" "Yes," Marin said. "That's fine." Ruth studied her for another long moment, then nodded. "All right then. I'll leave you two to get acquainted. Stew's on the stove, bread's wrapped in the cloth on the table. Don't let Jace convince you he can't cook. He's just lazy about it." Jace was shaking his head emphatically, but Ruth had already turned to leave. She paused at her own wagon, looking back at Marin. "One more thing," she said. "Folks in town are going to talk. They're going to say things about both of you. About him not speaking. About you being... well, about you. Don't give them the satisfaction of caring. You survive out here by being tougher than the land, not by worrying what small minds think." Then she climbed onto her wagon and drove away, leaving Marin and Jace alone for the first time. The silence stretched between them. Jace picked up her carpet bag and gestured toward the house. Marin followed him inside. The interior was simple but clean. One main room served as kitchen and living space, with a stone fireplace at one end and a cast-iron stove at the other. A door led to what must be the bedroom. The furniture was handmade and functional. A table, 2 chairs, a shelf for dishes and supplies. Jace set her bag down and moved to the stove, ladling stew into 2 bowls. He set them on the table along with the bread Ruth had mentioned, then pulled out a chair and gestured for Marin to sit. They ate in silence. The stew was good, simple but filling. Marin hadn't realized how hungry she was until she started eating. Halfway through the meal, Jace reached for his notebook again. He wrote and pushed it across the table. "Ask whatever you want. Better to know now than wonder." Marin set down her spoon. "Why did you advertise for a wife? Why not marry someone local?" He wrote, "Tried. Women here want men who can sweet-talk them, who fit what they expect. I don't fit. Got tired of failing at it." "What made you think I would be different?" "Your letter. You didn't write about romance or love or any of that nonsense. You wrote about wanting a purpose, about being tired of being invisible. I understood that." Marin felt something tight in her chest loosen slightly. "What do you expect from me? From this marriage?" Jace set down his pencil and looked at her for a long moment. Then he wrote slowly, carefully. "Partnership, honesty. Shared work and shared survival. Respect even when things are hard. That's all. If love comes, fine. If it doesn't, we'll still have something real." "And if I can't handle it?" Marin asked quietly. "If the work is too hard or the isolation is too much?" "Then you leave. I won't force you to stay. But I need to know you're trying. I can handle failure. I can't handle someone giving up without fighting." Marin thought about Philadelphia, about her sister's house and the way Catherine's husband looked through her like she was furniture, about the years of being too much and never enough. "I don't give up," she said. "That's not my problem. My problem is that I've spent my whole life fighting for people who never thought I was worth the effort. I'm done with that. If I'm going to fight, it's going to be for something that matters. Jace nodded slowly. Then he wrote one more line. Welcome to the frontier. Everything here matters. They finished dinner in silence, but it was a different kind of quiet now. Not uncomfortable exactly. More like two people learning the shape of something new. After the meal, Jace showed her the rest of the small house. The bedroom was barely large enough for the bed and a small dresser. The bed itself was handmade like everything else, with a quilt that looked worn but well mended. I'll sleep in the main room tonight, Marin said. Give us both time to adjust. Jace frowned and reached for his notebook. We're getting married tomorrow. Might as well get used to sharing space. We will, Marin said firmly. Tomorrow. Tonight, I need to think. He looked like he might argue, then shrugged and nodded. He pulled a blanket and pillow from the dresser and handed them to her, then closed the bedroom door behind him. Marin made herself a bed on the floor near the fireplace. The house was cooling rapidly now that the sun had set, and she pulled the blanket tight around her shoulders. Through the bedroom door, she could hear the creak of the bed as Jace settled in for the night. She'd done it. She'd actually done it. Traveled 800 miles to marry a man she'd never met, who couldn't speak, in a place so foreign it might as well be another country. The smart thing would be to get back on that train tomorrow. To admit this had been a desperate, foolish mistake and return to Philadelphia before things got worse. But Marin had never been interested in doing the smart thing. The smart thing had kept her small and quiet and acceptable for 28 years, and where had it gotten her? Here, at least, she had a chance to be something more. She fell asleep to the sound of wind against the windows and the distant cry of some animal she couldn't name, and dreamed of a future that might actually belong to her. The minister arrived at dawn, riding a horse that looked as worn out as he did. Reverend Pike was a thin man with kind eyes and a gentle manner that seemed out of place on the frontier. "Good morning," he said, dismounting carefully. "You must be Miss Doyle. I'm glad you made it safely." Marin had been awake for hours, too nervous to sleep. She'd changed into her best dress, dark blue cotton that Catherine had insisted was too plain for a wedding, but was the nicest thing Marin owned. Jace emerged from the house, freshly shaved and wearing a clean shirt. He shook the minister's hand and gestured for them to come inside. The ceremony took less than 10 minutes. Reverend Pike read from a well-worn Bible, while Marin and Jace stood side by side in the small main room. There were no flowers, no guests, no music, just words spoken over two people who'd decided to gamble their futures on each other. "Do you, Marin Doyle, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, until death do you part?" Marin looked at Jace. He was watching her with that same careful neutrality, giving her space to choose. "I do," she said. Reverend Pike turned to Jace. "Do you," Jace called her, "take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, until death do you part?" Jace reached into his pocket and withdrew a card he'd clearly prepared in advance. It read simply, "I do. Then by the power vested in me, I pronounce you husband and wife." Reverend Pike closed his Bible and smiled. "You may kiss your bride, if you'd like." Jace looked at Marin, a question in his eyes. She stepped forward and kissed him quickly, a brief press of lips that was more formal than romantic. He tasted like coffee and smelled like soap and horses. When she pulled back, there was something different in his expression. Not happiness exactly, but maybe relief, like he'd been holding his breath and could finally exhale. Reverend Pike congratulated them both, accepted the small payment Jace offered, and left with the promise to return in a few months to check on them. And then they were alone again. Married, partners in whatever came next. Jace pulled out his notebook. Ruth was right about one thing. "I'm useless in a kitchen. If you can cook, that would help." Marin managed a small smile. "I can cook. What do you have for supplies?" He showed her what passed for a pantry. Flour, salt, some dried beans, a bit of bacon, eggs from the chickens, and not much else. "We'll need more," Marin said. "When do you go to town for supplies?" "Every 2 weeks, if weather allows. Last trip was 5 days ago, so we have time. List what you need, and I'll get it." They spent the morning in a kind of awkward dance, learning the rhythms of sharing space. Jace went out to tend the animals while Marin explored the house more thoroughly, taking stock of what needed fixing, what needed cleaning, what needed replacing. The house was in better shape than she'd expected. The roof was solid, the walls well chinked against the wind. But it was clear this had been a bachelor's home, functional but loveless, maintained but not cared for. She could change that. She could make this place feel like more than just shelter. When Jace came back in for lunch, she had bread and eggs ready. They ate quickly, and then he handed her his notebook again. Afternoon work, fence repair on East Pasture. You can help or stay here and settle in. Your choice. Marin looked down at her dress, then back at him. I'll help, but I'll need to change first. Do you have anything I can wear that won't get ruined? He disappeared into the bedroom and returned with an old shirt and a pair of pants that would be too big on her, but would work if she rolled the cuffs and used a belt. She changed in the bedroom, feeling strange in men's clothing, but appreciating the freedom of movement. When she emerged, Jace's eyes widened slightly. Surprise, maybe, or approval. He handed her a pair of work gloves, and they headed out together. The fence repair was harder than Marin expected. The posts were heavy, the wire difficult to manipulate, and the sun beat down without mercy. Within an hour, she was sweating and sore and questioning every decision that had brought her here. But Jace didn't coddle her. He showed her what needed doing and expected her to do it. When she struggled, he demonstrated again with patient efficiency. When she succeeded, he nodded acknowledgement and moved to the next section. They worked until sunset, when the light finally failed and they had to stop. Walking back to the house, Marin's hands were blistered and her shoulders ached, and she was more exhausted than she'd ever been in her life. But she'd done it. She'd worked alongside him without complaint or failure. That night, they shared the bed for the first time. They lay side by side in the darkness, not touching, both too tired for anything beyond sleep. Thank you, Marin whispered into the quiet, for not treating me like I'm fragile. In the darkness, she felt more than heard Jace's response. A small shift in the bed, a hand reaching out to very gently touch hers. Then sleep claimed them both, and tomorrow's work waited. The first week passed in a blur of physical exhaustion that left Marin too tired to think about anything except the next task. She woke before dawn because Jace did, stumbled through breakfast preparations while he handled the animals, then worked until her hands bled and her back screamed and the sun finally released them from its demands. She learned that frontier work didn't care about your feelings or your limitations. The chickens needed feeding whether you were tired or not. The garden needed watering. The firewood needed splitting. The house needed cleaning. The meals needed cooking. And underneath it all ran a constant current of anxiety because one mistake, one forgotten task, one moment of carelessness could mean the difference between survival and disaster. On the 8th day, Marin dropped a bucket of water she'd just hauled from the well. It hit the ground and split apart, spilling its contents into the dirt. She stood there staring at it, this stupid broken bucket that represented 20 minutes of work completely wasted, and something inside her finally cracked. "Damn it!" she shouted at nothing. "Damn it! Damn it! Damn it!" Jace appeared from around the side of the barn, concern etched across his face. He'd been repairing a loose board on the chicken coop. Marin pointed at the broken bucket, then at the well, then at herself with a kind of furious helplessness. "I can't do this. I can't haul enough water. I can't cook fast enough. I can't work hard enough. Everything takes twice as long as it should, and I'm so tired I can barely think, and now I've broken the bucket and—" She stopped because Jace had crossed the distance between them and placed his hands on her shoulders. Not roughly, but firmly enough to ground her. He looked her in the eyes and shook his head slowly. Then he pointed at the broken bucket, made a dismissive gesture, and pointed at the barn. "I don't understand," Marin said, her voice cracking. Jace released her shoulders and pulled out his notebook. His handwriting was faster now, less careful. "You've been here 8 days. I've been here 6 years. Stop comparing yourself to me." Bucket was old anyway. "I'll make another one tonight." "But I should be better at this by now," Marin said. "I should be useful." He wrote again, underlining one word twice. "You are useful. You've cooked every meal. You've kept the house cleaner than it's been in years. You've worked the garden, fed the chickens, helped with fence repair, and hauled water even though the well is 200 feet away, and you hate it. You think that's not useful?" Ruth could probably do all that in half the time. Ruth has lived on the frontier for 40 years. You've lived here for 8 days. Stop being stupid. Despite everything, Marin almost laughed. Did you just call me stupid? He nodded firmly, then added to his note, yes, because you're being stupid. You're one person, not 3. The work will get easier as you get stronger. Give yourself time. Marin looked at him, this man who'd agreed to marry her based on a few letters, who'd never once commented on her appearance or her struggles, who expected her to work hard but didn't expect her to be perfect. I'm not used to people being patient with me, she said quietly. Jace's expression softened. He wrote, I'm not patient. I'm practical. Breaking you down helps no one. Building you up helps both of us. That's not kindness. That's survival. He left her standing there and disappeared into the barn, returning a few minutes later with a different bucket, older and more battered than the one she'd broken, but functional. He handed it to her, then pointed at the well with raised eyebrows. Marin took the bucket. You're serious? You want me to go get more water right now? He nodded. Even though I just failed at it? He pulled out his notebook one more time. You didn't fail. The bucket failed. There's a difference. Now go get the water before I have to make dinner and we both starve. This time, Marin did laugh, a short surprised bark of sound that felt good in her chest. She took the bucket and headed back to the well. The water felt heavier than before, her arms shakier, but she made it back to the house without spilling a drop. It wasn't grace or skill, just stubborn determination not to prove Jace right about her being stupid. That night, after another silent dinner, Marin watched Jace work on constructing a new bucket from spare wood and metal strips he'd salvaged from somewhere. His hands moved with the confidence of someone who'd built and fixed things his entire life. Where did you learn all this? She asked. Carpentry, metalwork, farming, all of it? He paused his work and reached for the notebook he now kept constantly within arm's reach. My father. He was a builder back in Ohio. Taught me everything before he died. I was 16. Is that when you came west? No. Stayed in Ohio another 10 years. Worked for other builders. Saved money. People there knew I couldn't speak, so they'd known me since I was a child. It was fine. Then my mother died, and there was no reason to stay. Came west looking for land cheap enough to afford a loan. Do you miss it? Ohio? He considered this for a long moment before writing, I miss knowing where everything is. I miss not having to explain myself constantly, but I don't miss being the broken son of the dead builder. Here, I'm just Jace. The silence matters less when everyone expects you to fail anyway. Marin understood that more than he probably realized. In Philadelphia, I was just Catherine's unmarriageable sister, the one they invited to family dinners out of obligation and seated in the corner where I'd be least visible. At least here, when people judge me, it's honest. They're not pretending to care while they measure me for failure. Jace looked up from his work, his eyes meeting hers with something like recognition. He wrote, Maybe that's why we'll make this work. We're both done with pretending. Maybe, Marin agreed. He returned to his bucket construction and she to her mending, and the silence that fell between them felt less like absence and more like understanding. The second week brought a new challenge. Town. Jace had written a supply list the night before. Flour, sugar, salt, kerosene, nails, fabric for Marin to make proper work clothes. The list was practical and specific, the handwriting neat enough that any shopkeeper could read it. I'm coming with you, Marin announced at breakfast. Jace frowned and reached for his notebook. Town is 8 miles, takes all day. You'd be more useful here. I've been here 2 weeks and I haven't seen anything except this farm and the railway station. I'm coming. People there aren't kind. They'll stare, they'll whisper. You saw that at the station. I saw it in Philadelphia for 28 years. I can handle Tanner's Creek. Jace studied her for a long moment, then shrugged and nodded. He wasn't going to fight her on it. They set out after morning chores, the wagon rattling over rough roads that were barely more than worn paths through the grass. The day was clear and cool, the kind of weather that would have been pleasant if Marin wasn't so nervous about what waited at their destination. What are the people like? She asked. In town? Jace kept his eyes on the road, but pulled the reins into one hand so he could write with the other. Mixed. Some are decent, some are cruel. Most just want to survive and don't care about anyone else's business. The Brennans are good people. The Holcombs run the general store. Fair prices, don't gossip much. Avoid the Mercers. They own most of the land around here and think that makes them important. What's wrong with the Mercers? They enjoy other people's failures. Makes them feel bigger. Marin filed that information away. The town looked exactly as she remembered it from her arrival. Rough, unfinished, and vaguely hostile. They pulled up to the general store and Jace helped her down from the wagon, his hand steady on her arm. Inside, the store was dim and crowded with supplies stacked on every available surface. A woman behind the counter looked up as they entered, her expression shifting from neutral to interested when she saw Marin. "Well now," she said, "you must be Jace's new wife. Heard you actually stayed. I'm Margaret Holcomb." "Marin Calder," Marin said, trying out her married name for the first time in public. It felt strange in her mouth. Margaret's eyes flickered over Marin's body with the quick assessment women always made, but her expression didn't change. "Welcome to Tanner's Creek. I hope Jace is treating you well." Jace handed over his supply list. Margaret scanned it and nodded, moving off to gather items from the shelves. The door opened behind them and 3 women entered, their conversation dying the moment they saw Marin and Jace. "Oh," one of them said, "it's them." The tallest woman, dressed in a green dress that was far too fancy for a frontier town, stepped forward. "You're the mail-order bride. I'm Constance Mercer. My husband owns most of the land around here." Marin recognized the trap immediately. This woman wanted her to feel small, wanted her to apologize for existing. She'd dealt with dozens of Constance Mercers in Philadelphia. "Marin Calder," she said evenly. "Pleased to meet you." "I'm sure." Constance's smile was sharp. "It's very brave of you to come all this way. Must have been quite desperate to marry a man who can't even speak." Jace's hand tightened on the counter, but Marin spoke before he could reach for his notebook. "Actually, I find it refreshing," she said. "My last suitor talked constantly and said absolutely nothing of value. At least with Jace, when he communicates, he means it." One of the other women made a small choking sound that might have been a suppressed laugh. Constance's smile froze. "How charming. Well, I'm sure you'll find frontier life very educational. It's not easy out here, especially for women who aren't used to hard work." "Then it's fortunate I am used to it," Marin said. "I spent 2 years managing a boarding house in Philadelphia. 20 residents, 3 meals a day, laundry, cleaning, bookkeeping. This is actually easier since I only have to take care of 2 people instead of 20. That was a lie, but Constance didn't need to know that. Margaret returned with an armful of supplies, clearly having listened to the entire exchange. "Here's your flour, Jace, and I threw in some extra sugar since you're probably going through more of it now with Marin's cooking." Jace nodded gratefully and began loading items into a crate. Constance wasn't finished. "I suppose we'll see how long she lasts. Most city women don't make it through their first winter. The isolation drives them mad." "Then it's a good thing I'm not most city women," Marin said. She turned to Margaret. "Do you have any fabric suitable for work clothes? I need to make myself some proper things for outdoor chores." "I do. Come look at what I have." Marin followed Margaret to a corner of the store where bolts of fabric were stacked. Behind her, she could hear Constance and her friends whispering, but she refused to give them the satisfaction of looking back. Margaret pulled out several options, heavy cotton in browns and dark blues. "These'll hold up well, and they don't show dirt as much, which you'll appreciate. You really ran a boarding house?" "I really did," Marin said, "for 2 years." "Then you'll do fine out here. Don't let Constance bother you. She's just bitter because she thought her husband's money would buy her respect, and she's learning it doesn't work that way." Marin selected 2 bolts of fabric and carried them back to the counter. Jace had finished loading the supplies and was settling their account with Margaret's husband, who'd emerged from the back room. As they prepared to leave, the door opened again, and a man entered. Tall, broad-shouldered, with the kind of face that looked like it had forgotten how to smile years ago. He wore expensive clothes that seemed designed to announce his importance. "Calder," he said, his voice carrying across the store. "Heard you found yourself a wife." Jace's entire body went rigid. He didn't reach for his notebook, didn't acknowledge the man at all. "This is my husband, Thomas," Constance said, her voice dripping false sweetness. Thomas, this is Marin Calder. A Thomas Mercer looked at Marin the way one might examine livestock at auction, assessing value and finding it lacking. Interesting choice, Calder. Most men go for pretty when they order a wife. You went for practical. The insult was delivered with a smile, which somehow made it worse. Marin had spent her entire life listening to men like Thomas Mercer explain why she wasn't good enough. She was done being quiet about it. "Mr. Mercer," she said, her voice level and cold, "I understand you own most of the land around here. Tell me, do you work it yourself, or do you just collect rent while other people break their backs to make you rich?" The store went absolutely silent. Thomas's smile disappeared. "You manage other people's labor," Marin interrupted, "which means you tell people what to do, but don't actually know how to do it yourself. Whereas my husband built his house with his own hands, works his own land, and doesn't need to pay people to do his work for him. So when you talk about interesting choices, perhaps you should consider that some of us value competence over empty words." Thomas's face flushed red. "You little—" "Careful," Margaret said sharply from behind the counter. "That's a customer you're about to insult, and I don't appreciate that kind of language in my store." Jace had his hand on Marin's elbow now, guiding her firmly toward the door. She went, her heart pounding, half exhilarated and half terrified by what she'd just done. They loaded the wagon in silence and pulled away from the store with Thomas Mercer staring after them, fury written across his face. Once they were clear of town, Jace pulled the wagon to a stop and turned to face her. His expression was unreadable. Marin braced herself for anger. She'd overstepped. She'd made an enemy of the most powerful man in the area. She'd probably ruined whatever fragile peace Jace had managed to build here. Jace reached for his notebook and wrote for a long time. When he finally handed it to her, his handwriting was messier than usual, like the words had come fast. "No one has ever defended me like that. Ever. Most people either ignore the insults or agree with them. You made an enemy today. Mercer won't forget that, but you also did something I've never been able to do. You made him look small in front of his wife and the whole store." "Thank you." Marin read it twice, relief flooding through her. "You're not angry?" He shook his head emphatically and wrote more. "I'm proud and a little scared of you. Remind me never to make you that mad." Despite everything, Marin laughed. "I can't promise that. You might do something stupid and I'll have to tell you about it." Jace's mouth quirked into what might have been the first real smile she'd seen from him. He snapped the reins and they continued home. That night, something shifted between them. They worked through evening chores with a new ease, a rhythm that came from shared experience rather than careful politeness. When Jace showed her how to milk the cow, a task she'd been dreading, he was patient with her fumbling attempts and didn't laugh when milk sprayed everywhere except into the bucket. When she finally managed a steady stream, she looked up to find him giving her an approving nod that felt better than any praise she'd received in years. At dinner, she asked him about the farm's history, and he filled page after page of his notebook telling her about the first winter, when he'd nearly frozen to death because he hadn't properly chinked the walls. About the time a bear had gotten into his supplies and he'd had to survive on nothing but beans for 3 weeks. About the neighbors who'd helped him raise the barn and the ones who'd refused because they thought a man who couldn't speak had no business trying to farm. Marin told him about Philadelphia, about her parents dying when she was young and growing up in her older sister's shadow. Always too big and too loud and too much for a world that wanted women to take up less space. "Catherine used to measure my portions at dinner," she said quietly. "She'd count exactly how many potatoes I took, how much bread. She said she was helping me, but really she was just ashamed of me. Her husband was worse. He'd make jokes about how much it cost to feed me, like I was some kind of burden they'd charitably taken on." Jace's face darkened. He wrote, "Your sister is an idiot. You work harder than most men I know. You should eat as much as you need." The world doesn't usually see it that way. The world is full of people who judge what they don't understand. I stopped caring what they think a long time ago. You should too. "I'm trying," Marin said. "It's harder than it sounds." Everything worth doing is. They cleaned up from dinner together, moving around each other in the small kitchen with increasing coordination. When Marin reached for a dish at the same moment Jace did, their hands touched, and neither pulled away immediately. That night, when they went to bed, Jace hesitated before climbing in beside her. Marin understood the question he wasn't asking. They were married, had been for 2 weeks now, but they'd been too exhausted and too uncertain to be anything more than reluctant roommates sharing a bed. "It's all right," she said softly. "I'm not afraid of you." He settled in beside her, still leaving space between them, but less than before. In the darkness, his hand found hers. They fell asleep that way, fingers loosely intertwined, two people learning how to build something real from the fragments they'd carried to this place. The next morning brought rain, the first real rain since Marin's arrival. It started as a light drizzle during breakfast and built into a steady downpour by mid-morning, drumming against the roof and turning the yard into a sea of mud. Jace looked frustrated, clearly having planned outdoor work that now couldn't happen. "What do you usually do when it rains?" Marin asked. He wrote, "Repairs inside, maintenance on tools. Sometimes just sit and wait it out. Rain doesn't last long here usually." "Teach me something," Marin said. "Something I don't know how to do that would be useful." Jace considered this, then disappeared into the bedroom and returned with a leather harness that looked like it had seen better days. He handed it to Marin along with some tools and his notebook. "This needs new stitching in 3 places. I'll show you how. Every frontier wife needs to know basic leatherwork. Saves money and time." They spent the morning huddled near the window for light, Jace guiding Marin's hands through the process of punching holes and threading tough cord through leather. It was precise, frustrating work that required strength and patience in equal measure. "Like this?" Marin asked, holding up her third attempt. Jace examined it, nodded approval, and pointed to the next section that needed repair. By afternoon, the rain had intensified into a full storm. Thunder cracked overhead and lightning lit the dim interior of the house in brief, stark flashes. Marin found herself moving closer to Jace without quite meaning to. She wasn't afraid of storms, but this felt different, more violent, more personal somehow. Jace set down the harness and stood, moving to the window. He stared out at the rain with an expression Marin couldn't read. "What is it?" she asked. He didn't respond for a moment, then pulled out his notebook. "If this keeps up, the creek will flood. Last time that happened, I lost half the vegetable garden and 3 chickens. Can't afford that this year." "What can we do?" "Wait. See how high the water gets. If it reaches the garden, we'll have to try to divert it or save what we can. Nothing to do until then." They waited. The storm raged for hours, showing no signs of stopping. By evening, Jace was pacing near the windows, his anxiety clear despite his silence. Marin made a simple dinner that neither of them had much appetite for. The wind howled around the house, finding gaps in the walls she hadn't noticed before, and the temperature dropped until she could see her breath inside. "Come away from the window," she finally said to Jace. "Staring at it won't change anything." He turned to look at her, his face drawn with worry. "I mean it," Marin said. "You told me the first day that the only thing you can't handle is someone giving up without fighting. Well, you can't fight the weather. All you can do is prepare for tomorrow and hope the damage isn't as bad as you fear. Exhausting yourself tonight won't help anyone." Jace stared at her for a long moment, then slowly nodded. He moved away from the window and sat at the table, his shoulders tight with tension. Marin sat across from him. "Tell me about the first year, not just the hard parts. Tell me something good that happened." He looked surprised by the question. Then he picked up his notebook and wrote, "First successful harvest. It wasn't much, barely enough to get through winter, but I'd grown it myself. Planted, tended, harvested it all alone. Felt like proof I could actually survive out here." "That's not nothing," Marin said. "What else?" "The first time Ruth came to check on me. I thought she was going to tell me to give up and go back east. Instead, she brought me a jar of preserves and showed me how to properly smoke meat so it would last. Turned out she just wanted to make sure I wasn't going to die of stupidity." Marin smiled. "She seems like the kind of person who'd keep you alive just to prove you wrong about something." Jace's mouth quirked. He wrote, "Exactly. She told me I was too stubborn to die, so I might as well learn to do things right." They talked, or rather Marin talked, and Jace wrote, until the storm's fury finally began to ease. By the time they went to bed, the rain had reduced to a steady patter, and the wind had died down to occasional gusts. Marin was nearly asleep when she felt Jace's arm slide around her waist, pulling her closer. She stiffened for just a second, then relaxed against him. His warmth was solid and real, a comfort against the cold and the uncertainty of what tomorrow's damage might bring. She fell asleep listening to his breathing and the rain on the roof, and didn't dream at all. Morning revealed the cost of the storm. The creek had indeed flooded, washing away nearly a third of the vegetable garden. 2 sections of fence were down. The chicken coop had lost part of its roof, leaving the birds huddled miserably in one corner. Jace surveyed the damage with a grim expression, then pulled out his notebook. Could be worse. Lost the garden, but the house is intact. Fences can be repaired. New roof on the coop will take a day. We'll manage. Tell me what to do, Marin said. They spent the next 3 days in constant motion. Marin learned to hammer fence posts while Jace worked on the chicken coop roof. She salvaged what vegetables she could from the flooded garden while he cleared debris from around the barn. They worked until their hands bled and their backs screamed, and then they worked some more. On the 3rd evening, as they finally sat down to a late dinner, Jace wrote something and slid it across the table. You didn't complain once. Not about the work, not about the loss, not about being tired. Most people would have. Complaining doesn't fix anything, Marin said, and I meant what I said at the wedding. I'm done fighting for people who don't think I'm worth the effort. This place is ours. Fighting for it makes sense. Jace reached across the table and took her hand. Not writing, not communicating anything except simple, solid connection. They sat that way until their food got cold, and neither of them cared. Summer deepened into the kind of heat that made the air shimmer and turned the ground to cracked dust. Marin had been at the farm for 6 weeks now, and her body had changed in ways she hadn't expected. Not smaller, the hard work and large portions had seen to that, but stronger. Her arms had muscle she could actually see. Her hands, once soft from city life, were calloused and capable. She could lift a full water bucket without stopping to rest halfway back from the well. The shame she'd carried her entire life hadn't disappeared, but it had become quieter, easier to ignore when she was too busy surviving to care what anyone thought. They fell into town twice more for supplies, and each time Constance Mercer found some new way to make a cutting remark about Marin's appearance or Jace's silence. Marin had learned to smile pleasantly and respond with facts that made Constance's face pinch with irritation. Still here, I see, Constance said during their last visit, her voice dripping false concern. Most women find the isolation unbearable by now. Most women don't have the spine for frontier life, Marin replied. Fortunately, I do. Thomas Mercer had been notably absent from these encounters, which suited Marin fine. She'd made an enemy of a powerful man, and sooner or later there would be consequences for that. They came on a Wednesday afternoon in late July. Marin was working in what remained of the garden, trying to coax life from vegetables that had survived the flood, when she heard the sound of multiple horses approaching. She straightened, shading her eyes against the sun. 4 riders. Thomas Mercer led them, his expensive hat and tailored vest looking absurd in the dust and heat. The 3 men with him had the worn, hard look of ranch hands who'd seen their share of trouble. Jace emerged from the barn, his body going tense the moment he saw who was approaching. He moved to stand beside Marin, his presence protective without being obvious about it. Thomas dismounted slowly, making a show of surveying the property. Calder, Mrs. Calder, lovely day. Jace didn't respond, didn't reach for his notebook, just waited. I've been thinking about our last conversation, Thomas said, directing his words at Marin, about competence and empty words. It occurred to me that you might benefit from seeing what real competence looks like. I see it every day, Marin said evenly. My husband built this entire farm with his own hands. What exactly have you built, Mr. Mercer? Thomas's smile was cold. An empire. While your husband plays at farming on land that's barely worth the effort. Tell me, how much did you yield from your last harvest, Calder? Jace's jaw tightened, but he still didn't move to write anything. Enough to survive the winter, Marin said, which is more than can be said for people who've never worked a day in their lives. Survival isn't success, Thomas said. It's just prolonged failure. I own 18,000 acres. I employ 40 men. I supply beef to 3 territories. That's success. This, he gestured dismissively at the farm. This is barely subsistence. Then why are you here? Marin asked. If we're so beneath your notice, why ride out to tell us about it? Thomas's expression hardened. Because your husband needs to understand his place, and you need to understand that defending him against me was a mistake. I don't forget insults, Mrs. Calder, and I don't tolerate disrespect from people who have nothing. We have enough, Marin said. She could feel Jace's tension beside her, practically vibrating with the effort of staying silent and still. For now, Thomas said. But winter's coming, and winters out here are hard on people who aren't prepared. Fences fail, animals die, supplies run out, accidents happen. He let that last word hang in the air like a threat. It would be a shame if something happened to this little farm, all that work for nothing. Jace finally moved, pulling out his notebook and writing quickly. He held it up. Leave. Now. Thomas laughed. Or what? You'll write angry notes at me? The silent farmer and his fat wife are going to make me leave? The slur hit Marin like a physical blow, but she forced herself not to react. She'd heard worse. She'd survived worse. What surprised her was Jace's response. He stepped forward, moving between Marin and Thomas with deliberate intent. He didn't write anything, didn't make a sound. He just stared at Thomas with an expression that promised violence if the man said one more word about Marin. One of the ranch hands shifted nervously in his saddle. Boss, maybe we should— Quiet, Thomas snapped. He studied Jace for a long moment, then smiled. You think you're protecting her? You think your silence makes you noble? It just makes you weak. A real man would defend his wife with words, not threatening looks and scribbled notes. Marin put her hand on Jace's arm, feeling the muscle coiled tight beneath his shirt. A real man, she said clearly, doesn't need to run his mouth to prove his worth. My husband has built more with his hands than you've built with all your money and all your words. And if you think silence makes him weak, you're even stupider than I thought. Thomas's face flushed red. You little— We're done here, Marin interrupted. You've delivered your threats. You've tried to make us feel small. It didn't work. Now get off our land before I fetch the rifle and make you leave. It was a bluff. Marin had never fired a rifle in her life. But Thomas didn't know that. He stared at her for a long moment, his expression ugly with rage. Then he mounted his horse in one smooth motion. You'll regret this, both of you. When your crops fail and your animals die and you're begging for help, remember that you chose this. He wheeled his horse around and rode off, his men following. The dust from their departure hung in the air long after the sound of hooves had faded. Marin realized she was shaking, not from fear, but from anger and adrenaline and the sick certainty that they'd just made things much worse. Jace was writing furiously in his notebook. When he handed it to her, his handwriting was nearly illegible. You shouldn't have done that. He'll retaliate. He owns half the county. He could destroy us and no one would stop him. So what was I supposed to do? Marin demanded. Stand there and let him insult you? Insult us? Let him think we're afraid of him? Yes. Better afraid and alive than proud and destroyed. I didn't come 800 miles to spend my life being afraid of bullies, Marin said. I did that in Philadelphia. I'm not doing it here. This isn't Philadelphia. There are no laws here that matter. No police, no protection. Just power and who has more of it. Mercer has more. We need to remember that. Then what do? Apologize? Beg for mercy? Hope he decides to leave us alone? Jace stared at her, frustration and fear warring in his expression. Finally he wrote, We survive. We work harder. We prepare for winter and hope he loses interest or finds easier targets. That's all we can do. Marin wanted to argue, but she could see the exhaustion in his face. This wasn't the first time he'd faced someone like Thomas Mercer. It probably wasn't even the 10th time. He'd learned through hard experience that fighting powerful men only got you hurt. All right, she said quietly. We survive. But she didn't apologize. And she didn't regret defending him. That night, they barely spoke. Jace worked on repairing a saddle that didn't really need fixing, his movements sharp with leftover anger. Marin prepared dinner in silence, her mind racing through possibilities and worst-case scenarios. When they finally went to bed, Jace pulled her close with an intensity that felt almost desperate. I'm sorry, Marin whispered into the darkness, for making things harder. She felt rather than heard his response, a small shake of his head, his arms tightening around her. They fell asleep that way, holding on to each other like anchors against whatever storm was coming. 3 days passed with no sign of Mercer or his men. Marin started to hope that maybe the threats had been empty, just words meant to scare them into submission. Then Ruth showed up. She arrived late morning, her horse lathered with sweat like she'd been riding hard. Jace was out checking the fence line, and Marin was alone when Ruth dismounted and strode toward the house. "Where's Jace?" she demanded without preamble. "East pasture. What's wrong?" "Mercer's been talking in town, telling everyone that Jace's farm is failing, that you two won't make it through winter, that he might have to foreclose on the land for unpaid debts." Marin felt her stomach drop. "What debts? Jace owns this land free and clear. He told me—" "He does own it," Ruth interrupted. "But Mercer's claiming Jace owes him money for supplies advanced last winter. Says he has documentation proving it. That's a lie. Of course it's a lie, but Mercer owns the judge in Tanner's Creek. If he produces fake documents and takes Jace to court, there's a good chance the judge will rule in his favor. Then Mercer can claim the land legally." Marin's mind raced. Can Jace prove the documents are fake? How? He can't testify in court, and even if he could write out his testimony, Mercer's lawyer would tear it apart. A silent man trying to defend himself against a respected landowner with paperwork and witnesses, it wouldn't even be close. "So what do we do?" Ruth's expression was grim. "You find a way to make Mercer back off before this gets to court, or you prepare to lose everything." Jace returned an hour later to find both women waiting for him. Ruth explained the situation while Jace's face went progressively paler. When she finished, he sat down heavily at the table and stared at his hands. Finally, he wrote, "I should have kept my head down, should have ignored his insults at the store. This is my fault." "This is Mercer's fault," Marin said sharply. "He's a bully and a liar, and he's trying to steal from you because you dared to exist in a way he doesn't approve of." "Doesn't matter whose fault it is. Matters what happens next." "Then we fight," Marin said. "We find proof he's lying. How? He has money, influence, fake documents. We have nothing. We have the truth." Jace laughed bitterly and wrote, "Truth doesn't matter out here, only power matters. I don't have power. I never have. That's why I came to the frontier, because back east I was just the silent boy who couldn't compete. Out here, I thought hard work would be enough." I was wrong. Marin had never seen him like this, defeated, hopeless. It scared her more than Mercer's threats. "Don't," she said firmly. "Don't give up before we've even tried to fight." What fight? What do we have that could possibly stop him? Ruth had been listening quietly. Now she spoke up. "You have something Mercer doesn't expect. You have Marin." Both Jace and Marin turned to look at her. "Mercer thinks you're weak because you can't speak," Ruth continued, addressing Jace. "He thinks Marin is just some desperate city woman who doesn't understand frontier life. He's underestimating both of you. That's an advantage." "How?" Marin asked. "I don't know yet, but I know this. Mercer's arrogant. Arrogant men make mistakes. They get sloppy. If we watch him carefully enough, he'll slip up and give us something we can use against him." It wasn't much of a plan, but it was better than surrender. Over the next week, they tried to continue normal farm work while watching for any sign of Mercer's next move. Marin made trips to town on her own, listening to gossip, and trying to gauge who might be sympathetic to their cause. Most people were neutral at best. Mercer employed too many people, owned too much land. No one wanted to make an enemy of him over a silent farmer and his outsider wife. But Margaret Holcomb pulled Marin aside during one visit. "I heard what Mercer's planning. It's not right." "Can you help?" Marin asked. Margaret's expression was pained. "Not openly. My husband does business with Mercer. If we take sides against him, he could ruin us. But—" She hesitated, then leaned closer. "Mercer's ranch hand, the young one named Daniel, he doesn't like his boss much. He drinks at the saloon most nights. If someone were to buy him a few drinks and ask the right questions, he might say things he shouldn't." It wasn't much, but Marin filed the information away. That night she told Jace what Margaret had said. He wrote, "Too dangerous. If Mercer finds out you're digging for information, he'll escalate. And if we do nothing, we lose everything anyway." Jace stared at her, conflict clear in his expression. Finally he wrote, "If you do this, I'm coming with you. You'll stand out. People will notice and report back to Mercer. Don't care. Not letting you walk into a saloon alone. Not negotiable. Marin wanted to argue, but she could see the determination in his face. All right, together then. They waited until Saturday night, when the saloon would be crowded enough that 2 more people wouldn't attract immediate attention. Marin wore her simplest dress, and Jace left his notebook at home, relying on gestures and Marin's voice to communicate. The saloon was exactly what Marin had expected, loud, smoky, and full of men who looked at her with varying degrees of surprise and suspicion when she walked in with Jace. Daniel was easy to spot, young, maybe 20, with the kind of face that hadn't yet learned to hide what he was thinking. He sat alone at a corner table, already several drinks in based on the empty glasses in front of him. Marin approached while Jace hung back near the bar, close enough to intervene if needed, but not so close as to be obvious. "Mind if I join you?" Marin asked. Daniel looked up, startled. "You're Calder's wife." "I am, and you work for Thomas Mercer." He immediately looked nervous. "I don't want trouble." "Neither do I. I just want to talk." She sat down without waiting for permission. "Can I buy you a drink?" Daniel eyed her suspiciously. "Why would you do that?" "Because you look like you could use one, and because I'm curious about what it's like working for the most powerful man in the county." It was shameless flattery, and they both knew it, but Daniel was drunk enough to respond to it anyway. "It's not as good as people think. Mercer's a hard man to work for." Marin signaled the bartender for another round. "How so?" "He expects perfection, but doesn't pay for it. Works us like dogs and threatens to fire anyone who complains. Half the men are only there because they can't find work anywhere else." "Sounds difficult." Daniel took a long drink. "You don't know the half of it. Last month he had us move 200 head of cattle from one pasture to another, then changed his mind and had us move them back. All because he wanted to prove to some visiting businessman that he could make his men do whatever he wanted. Cost us 3 days of work for nothing." Marin listened, made sympathetic noises, and kept the drinks coming. After the 3rd glass, Daniel started talking more freely. "The worst part is the lying," he said, his words starting to slur. "He's always scheming, always figuring out ways to take what isn't his, like this thing with your husband's farm." Marin's pulse quickened, but she kept her expression neutral. "What thing?" Daniel leaned forward conspiratorially. "Mercer's planning to claim your husband owes him money. Got his foreman to fake up some documents saying they bought supplies on credit, but it's all lies. Your husband never bought nothing from Mercer. We all know it. But Mercer's got the judge in his pocket, so..." He made a helpless gesture. "Why would Mercer want our farm? It's small, not worth much." "It's not about worth. It's about pride. Your wife, you embarrassed him in front of the whole town. Made him look small. Mercer can't let that stand, so he's going to take everything you have to teach you a lesson." Marin forced herself to breathe normally. "These fake documents, where does he keep them?" Daniel's eyes went wide, like he'd just realized he'd said too much. I shouldn't have." "You didn't tell me anything I didn't already suspect," Marin said gently. "But if you know where those documents are, and if there's any way to prove they're fake, you'd be helping stop an innocent man from losing everything. I'd lose my job. Maybe worse. You could also sleep at night knowing you did the right thing." Daniel stared into his empty glass for a long moment. Then he said quietly, "Mercer's office, in his house. He keeps all his important papers in a safe behind his desk. The combination is his daughter's birthday, April 7th, so 407. Marin felt like her heart had stopped. "You're sure?" "I've seen him open it a dozen times. He's not as careful as he thinks he is." Daniel stood up unsteadily. "I didn't tell you nothing. If Mercer asks, I never talked to you." He stumbled away before Marin could respond. She found Jace near the bar, his eyes questioning. She gave a small nod and they left together, not speaking until they were well away from the saloon. "He told me everything," Marin said as soon as they were alone. "Where the documents are, how to get to them. We can prove Mercer is lying." Jace pulled out his notebook, his handwriting sharp in the moonlight. "How? Break into his house? Steal from his safe? That's not fighting back, that's committing a crime. It's only a crime if we get caught. And if we do get caught, Mercer will have us arrested or shot. There's no law out here that would protect us." So we make sure we don't get caught. Jace stared at her like she'd lost her mind. He wrote, "This is insane. We can't break into Thomas Mercer's house. We'll be killed. And if we don't, we lose the farm. We lose everything we've worked for. We lose the only place I've ever felt like I belonged." Marin's voice cracked on that last word. "I won't go back to Philadelphia. I won't go back to being invisible and ashamed and useless. I'd rather die trying to save this than live, knowing I gave up without fighting." Jace's expression was anguished. He wrote, "I won't let you die for a farm. Then help me make sure that doesn't happen. Help me do this right." They stood in the darkness for a long time, the only sound the distant noise from the saloon and the wind through the grass. Finally, Jace took her hand and squeezed it once. Then he wrote, "If we do this, we do it together. And we do it smart. No heroics. No taking chances we don't have to. Agreed?" Agreed. They spent the next 2 days planning. Ruth, when they told her what they intended, called them both idiots and then helped them plan anyway. "Mercer hosts a poker game every Tuesday night," she said. "Starts at 8, usually goes until midnight or later. His wife always goes to bed early because she hates the noise. That's your window. Most of the house will be empty except for the game room." "How do we get in?" Marin asked. "Kitchen door, west side of the house. The lock is broken, has been for months. Mercer's too cheap to fix it." Jace wrote, "How do you know all this?" Ruth's smile was grim. "I used to work in that house before I married my husband. Mercer hasn't changed much since then, including his security." They went over the plan a dozen times. Jace would wait outside with the horses, ready for a quick escape. Marin would go in alone. She was smaller, quieter, and if caught could potentially talk her way out better than Jace could write his way out. The night of the poker game arrived too fast. Marin dressed in dark colors and tried not to think about everything that could go wrong. Jace drove them to within half a mile of Mercer's house, then pulled the wagon off the road into a small copse of trees. He wrote, "Last chance to change your mind. We can leave right now. Find another way." "There is no other way," Marin said. "You know that." He looked at her for a long moment, then pulled her close and kissed her. Not gently, not carefully, but with the desperate intensity of someone who might not get another chance. When they broke apart, Marin was shaking. "I'll be careful. I promise." Jace nodded, clearly not trusting himself to write anything else. Marin walked the remaining distance alone, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. Mercer's house loomed ahead, a sprawling 2-story structure that screamed wealth and power. Lights blazed in one room where the poker game was happening. Rough laughter drifted out into the night. Marin circled to the west side, found the kitchen door, and tested the handle. It turned smoothly. She was inside. The kitchen was dark and empty, smelling of old grease and tobacco smoke. Marin stood still for a moment, letting her eyes adjust, listening for any sound that might indicate someone was nearby. Nothing. She moved through the kitchen into a hallway, her footsteps silent on expensive carpet. Ruth had described the layout of the house. Office was on the first floor, third door on the right. Marin counted doors. 1, 2, 3. The office door was closed but unlocked. She slipped inside and closed it behind her, her breath coming fast and shallow. Mercer's desk dominated the room, massive and ornate. Behind it hung a painting of a mountain landscape. Marin moved around the desk and carefully lifted the painting away from the wall. There was the safe, exactly where Daniel had said it would be. 407. April 7th. Marin's hands trembled as she worked the combination. It took 3 tries before she got it right, and the safe door swung open. Inside were stacks of papers, some money, a few pieces of jewelry. Marin rifled through the papers quickly, looking for anything with Jace's name on it. There, a document claiming Jace owed $300 for supplies purchased on credit last winter. It was dated and signed, complete with what looked like an official seal. Marin pulled it out and studied it. The paper was too new, the ink too fresh. This had been created recently, not months ago. And the signature. Mercer had forged Jace's name, but he'd gotten it wrong. Jace's handwriting had a distinctive slant that this signature lacked. It wouldn't hold up to scrutiny, but Mercer was counting on no one scrutinizing it. He'd present it to his pet judge. The judge would rule in his favor, and that would be that. Not if Marin had anything to say about it. She was reaching for the document when she heard voices in the hallway outside. Her blood turned to ice. "Just need to get my good whiskey," Mercer's voice said. "The rot gut these idiots drink isn't fit for civilized men." "Your office?" another man asked. "Where else would I keep it?" Footsteps approaching, getting closer. Marin looked around frantically. There was nowhere to hide. The desk was solid with no space underneath. The closet was probably locked, and she couldn't climb out the window without making noise. The door handle started to turn. In that split second, Marin made a decision that was either brilliant or completely insane. She grabbed 3 documents from the safe, shoved them inside her shirt, slammed the safe closed, rehung the painting, and threw the office door open just as Mercer reached for the handle from the other side. He stumbled back, startled. "What the?" Marin called her. "Mr. Mercer," Marin said, forcing her voice steady. "We need to talk." Behind Mercer stood 2 other men, both holding cards and looking confused. "How did you get in my house?" Mercer demanded. "Your kitchen door doesn't lock properly. You should fix that." Marin stepped out of the office, pulling the door closed behind her. "I came to negotiate." Mercer's face flushed red. "You broke into my house to negotiate? You're planning to steal my husband's farm with fake documents. I'd say that makes us even on the breaking and entering front." One of the men behind Mercer whistled low. "She's got fire, Mercer. I'll give her that." "Shut up," Mercer snapped. He turned back to Marin. "I don't know what you think you're—" "I know exactly what you're doing," Marin interrupted. "And I know you can't afford to have people looking too closely at your business practices. So here's my offer. You drop this fraudulent claim against my husband, and I won't start asking questions about all your other land acquisitions. I'm willing to bet I'm not the first person you've done this to." It was a complete bluff, but Mercer's expression flickered with something that might have been concern. "You have no proof of anything," he said. "Don't I?" Marin patted her shirt where the documents were hidden. "Funny thing about keeping records, sometimes they tell stories you don't want told." Mercer's eyes narrowed. "If you took something from my office, then it's your word against mine, just like your fake documents against my husband's reputation. Difference is, I'm willing to make a lot more noise than Jace ever would. I'll go to every newspaper, every judge, every business owner in 3 territories. I'll make sure everyone knows that Thomas Mercer is a fraud and a thief. Your empire will crumble. You're bluffing. Try me." They stared at each other for a long moment. Marin could feel sweat running down her back, the documents scratching against her skin, her heart beating so hard she was sure everyone could hear it. Finally, Mercer said quietly, "Get out of my house." "Is that a yes to my offer?" "Get out." Marin walked past him, past the 2 confused poker players, through the hallway and the kitchen and out the broken door into the night. She didn't run until she was out of sight of the house. Then she ran like her life depended on it, because it probably did. Jace had the wagon ready and moving before she even fully climbed aboard. They didn't speak, didn't slow down until they were miles away, and the danger felt distant enough to breathe. Then Jace pulled the wagon to a stop and turned to her, his eyes wild with questions and fear and relief. Marin pulled the documents from her shirt and handed them to him. He looked at them, looked at her, then grabbed her and held on like he'd never let go. "I know," Marin whispered against his shoulder. "I know, it was stupid and dangerous, and we're probably not done with Mercer yet. But we have proof now. We have something to fight with." She felt him nod, felt his grip tighten. They sat there in the darkness for a long time, holding each other and trying not to think about what came next. Because Mercer wasn't the type to forgive, and this was far from over. The documents proved exactly what Marin had suspected. The debt claim was a forgery, poorly executed, and dated wrong. The other 2 papers she'd grabbed showed a pattern. Mercer had tried this same scheme on at least 2 other families in the past 3 years. Both had lost their land. Ruth examined the papers the next morning, her expression grim. "This is enough to prove fraud, but taking it to court means going up against Mercer's judge, and we already know how that would end." "So what do we do with it?" Marin asked. "We make copies. We spread the word quietly to people who matter. We make sure that if Mercer tries anything, there are enough people watching that he can't get away with it cleanly." Ruth looked at Jace. "You understand what this means? You're making permanent enemies, powerful ones. Jace wrote, already did that the moment Marin walked into his house. Might as well make it count. They spent the next week in a strange kind of waiting, working the farm while anticipating retaliation that could come at any moment. Marin found herself checking the horizon constantly, listening for the sound of approaching horses, jumping at unexpected noises. The stress was exhausting in a way physical labor never had been. On the 8th day after the break-in, smoke appeared on the horizon. Marin saw it first, a dark smudge against the afternoon sky. "Jace!" He came running from the barn, following her pointing finger. His face went pale. They both knew what fire meant out here. There was no fire brigade, no organized response. When something burned on the frontier, it burned until there was nothing left or until neighbors showed up to help. Jace grabbed his spyglass from the house and trained it on the smoke. When he lowered it, his expression was stricken. He wrote quickly, "Mercer's Ranch, big fire. Looks like the main barn." "Should we?" Marin started, then stopped. Should they help the man who'd threatened to destroy them? The man who'd tried to steal their farm? Jace was already moving, hitching the horses to the wagon with quick, efficient movements. He looked at Marin, and the question in his eyes was clear. She thought about Catherine in Philadelphia, about all the people who'd stood by and watched her struggle without offering help because helping wasn't convenient, or because she didn't deserve it, or because they just didn't care. She thought about becoming the kind of person who let others suffer because they'd been cruel first. "I'm coming," she said. They drove hard toward the smoke. As they got closer, the scope of the disaster became clear. Mercer's main barn was fully engulfed, flames reaching 30 feet into the sky. Men were running everywhere, some trying to salvage equipment, others working a bucket line from a nearby trough that was clearly inadequate for the task. Animals screamed inside the barn, horses and cattle trapped by fire and fear. Jace pulled the wagon to a stop and jumped down. Marin followed, her heart pounding. Thomas Mercer stood near the barn, his face blackened with soot, shouting orders that no one could hear over the roar of the flames. He saw Jace and Marin, and his expression twisted into something between surprise and rage. "What are you doing here?" he demanded. "Helping," Marin shouted back. "Where do you need us?" "I don't need help from—" "The barn is on fire and animals are dying," Marin interrupted. "You can hate us later. Right now, tell us what to do or get out of the way." For a second, she thought he might refuse. Then another scream came from inside the barn, and something in his face crumbled. "The horses," he said hoarsely. "There are 6 horses still inside. The door's blocked by a fallen beam. We can't get to them." Jace was already running toward the barn before Mercer finished speaking. Marin ran after him, ignoring Mercer's shout of protest. The heat near the barn was intense, making it hard to breathe. Smoke billowed out in thick black clouds. Jace reached the main door and grabbed the fallen beam blocking it, trying to lift. It wouldn't budge. Marin grabbed the other end. "On 3, 1, 2, 3. They heaved together. The beam shifted slightly. 2 of Mercer's men saw what they were doing and rushed over to help. The 4 of them lifted together and the beam crashed aside, opening access to the barn interior. Inside was hell. Flames crawled up the walls, consuming dry hay and old wood. The smoke was so thick Marin couldn't see more than a few feet. The horses were screaming, a sound that would haunt her nightmares for years. Jace didn't hesitate. He plunged into the smoke, heading toward the sound of the trapped animals. "You can't go in there!" one of Mercer's men yelled. But Marin was already following Jace into the burning barn. The heat was suffocating. Every breath felt like inhaling fire. Marin could barely see Jace ahead of her, just a dark shape moving through the smoke. She followed blindly, one hand stretched out to keep contact with him. They found the first horse in a stall near the back. It was rearing and kicking, wild with terror. Jace grabbed the stall door and yanked it open, then stepped back as the horse bolted past them toward the exit. 5 more to go. The smoke was getting thicker. Marin's eyes streamed tears. Her lungs burned. She could hear timbers creaking overhead. The barn wouldn't hold much longer. Jace moved to the next stall, fighting with a latch that had warped in the heat. Marin joined him, their hands working together until the mechanism finally gave way. Another horse thundered past them, 4 more. A section of roof collapsed 20 feet away, sending up a shower of sparks and burning debris. The remaining horses panicked harder, their screams becoming frantic. Maren could barely think through the pain in her lungs and the overwhelming urge to run, to get out, to save herself. But Jace was still moving deeper into the barn, and she refused to leave him. They freed 2 more horses, moving on instinct now because rational thought had become impossible. Maren's dress was smoking, small burns appearing on her arms where embers had landed. 2 horses left. Jace found the second-to-last horse, but the animal was down, collapsed in its stall. He grabbed its halter and pulled, trying to get it to stand. The horse didn't move. Maren joined him, both of them pulling together. The horse finally struggled to its feet and staggered out of the stall, disoriented but mobile. 1 more. The final horse was in the furthest stall, the one deepest in the barn where the fire was worst. The entire back wall was engulfed. The horse inside was a massive bay stallion, worth a fortune if it survived, worthless if it burned. Jace moved toward it, but a beam crashed down between him and the stall, cutting off access. He looked around frantically for another route. There wasn't one. Maren grabbed his arm and pulled, trying to get him to retreat. They'd saved 5 horses. That was enough. They needed to leave now before the whole structure came down on their heads. But Jace shook her off and began climbing over the burning beam. "No!" Maren tried to yell, but her voice was gone, destroyed by smoke. She grabbed at him, but he was already over, dropping down on the other side into the worst of the fire. Maren didn't think. She just climbed after him. The wood burned her hands, her legs, everywhere it touched. She hit the ground on the other side, and Jace was there, his face black with soot, his eyes wide with fear and anger that she'd followed. No time to argue. They reached the stallion's stall together. The animal was enormous and terrified, lashing out with hooves that could easily kill them. Jace approached slowly, hands out, making calming gestures that the horse couldn't possibly see through its panic. Somehow it worked. The stallion stilled just enough for Jace to grab its halter. Getting the stall door open was nearly impossible. The wood had swelled in the heat. Maren kicked at it while Jace pulled, and finally it gave way, swinging open with a crack. The stallion bolted, but not toward the exit. Confused by smoke and fire, it ran deeper into the barn. Jace ran after it, and Maren ran after Jace, her vision tunneling, her body moving on pure adrenaline. Jace caught the stallion's halter again, and this time physically wrestled its head around, pointing it toward the distant square of daylight that marked the barn entrance. The horse fought him, powerful muscles straining, but Jace held on with desperate strength. Finally, the stallion seemed to understand. It turned and ran for the exit, dragging Jace with it for several feet before he let go. Maren grabbed Jace's hand and they ran together, the barn collapsing behind them in a roar of flame and crashing timber. They burst out into daylight and kept running, didn't stop until they were 50 feet from the barn, and the heat was no longer unbearable. Maren collapsed to her knees, coughing so hard she thought her ribs would crack. Jace bent double beside her, his whole body shaking. Around them, Mercer's men were staring. The 6 horses they'd freed were being rounded up, shaken but alive. The barn was completely lost, flames still reaching toward the sky, but the animals had been saved. Thomas Mercer walked toward them slowly. His expression was unreadable. Maren tried to stand, but her legs wouldn't hold her. She stayed on her knees, looking up at the man who'd threatened to destroy them. "You saved them," Mercer said quietly. His voice was rough, whether from smoke or emotion Maren couldn't tell. "The horses. You saved all 6. Jace just nodded, still too winded to reach for his notebook. "That stallion alone is worth more than your entire farm," Mercer continued. "If he died, I'd have lost—" He stopped, shook his head. "Why did you help? After everything I've done to you, why would you risk your lives for my horses?" Maren found her voice, hoarse and painful, but functional. "Because they needed help. And because being cruel to you wouldn't make me any better than you've been to us." Mercer looked at her for a long moment. Then he did something Maren never expected. He sat down in the dirt beside them, his expensive clothes ruined, and put his head in his hands. "I've spent 20 years building this empire," he said, "accumulating land, money, power, making sure everyone knew I was important, that I mattered. And what did it get me? A wife who barely speaks to me, employees who fear me, and neighbors who hate me. You two have nothing compared to what I have, and yet you just risked everything to save my animals." He looked up at Jace. "I was wrong about you, about both of you. I thought silence made you weak, and that being different made her less. I was wrong. Jace pulled out his notebook with shaking hands. It took him 3 tries to write legibly. Does this mean you'll drop the land claim? Mercer's laugh was bitter. The land claim was always a lie. You knew it. I knew it. I just wanted to punish you for making me look small. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded paper, the forged debt document. He'd been carrying it with him. This ends now. No more threats, no more schemes. You've earned the right to be left alone. He held the paper out to Jace, who took it with obvious disbelief. I can't undo the kind of man I've been, Mercer continued, but I can at least stop being that man to you. Consider this my apology. It's not enough, but it's what I have. Marin and Jace sat in stunned silence as Mercer stood and walked away, shouting orders to his men about containing what remained of the fire. Did that actually just happen? Marin whispered. Jace looked at the paper in his hands, then at Marin, then back at the paper. Finally he wrote, I think we just made peace with our worst enemy by running into a burning building. I'm not sure if that makes us brave or stupid. Can it be both? Despite everything, the pain, the exhaustion, the burns covering her arms, Marin started laughing. It hurt her damaged throat, but she couldn't stop. Jace joined her, silent but shaking with the same slightly hysterical relief. They'd survived. Against all odds, they'd survived. Ruth found them still sitting there 20 minutes later. She took one look at their soot-covered faces and burned clothes and said, You two are the stupidest smart people I've ever met. We saved the horses, Marin croaked. You nearly died saving someone else's horses. Mercer's horses. Do you have any idea how insane that is? It worked, though, Marin pointed out. He dropped the land claim. Ruth stared at her. He what? Jace held up the forged document. You're telling me that running into a burning building convinced Thomas Mercer to give up his revenge plot? Apparently, Marin said. Ruth sat down heavily in the dirt beside them. Well, I suppose that's one way to handle it. Completely idiotic, but effective. They sat together in the dirt, watching the barn burn down to embers, and nobody said anything for a long time. The ride home was quiet. Both Marin and Jace were too exhausted to do more than slump in the wagon while the horses found their own way back. The sun was setting by the time the farm came into view, painting everything in shades of gold and red. Inside the house, Marin caught sight of herself in the small mirror near the wash basin. She barely recognized the woman staring back, face black with soot, hair singed, clothes scorched and torn, burns covering her arms and hands. She looked like she'd been through a war. She supposed, in a way, she had. Jace appeared behind her in the mirror's reflection. He looked just as bad, maybe worse. There was a burn on his neck that was going to scar. He pulled out his notebook. We should clean these burns. Ruth showed me what to do last year when I grabbed a hot pan without thinking. They spent the next hour carefully washing soot and debris from each other's wounds, applying the simple salve Ruth had given them for emergencies. It hurt worse than the original burns, but it had to be done. When they were finally clean and bandaged, they sat at the kitchen table and just looked at each other. We could have died today, Marin said. Jace nodded. That was the stupidest thing I've ever done, and I broke into Thomas Mercer's house last week, so that's saying something. Jace's mouth quirked. He wrote, Worth it, though. We're safe now. The farm is safe. Are we, though? Really? Mercer could change his mind tomorrow. He could decide that one dramatic gesture doesn't erase months of planning revenge. He could, but I don't think he will. You saw his face. That wasn't manipulation. That was genuine shock that someone would help him after how he treated them. Maybe it'll stick. Maybe it won't. All we can do is keep working and hope. Marin thought about that. Hope. Such a fragile thing to build a life on, and yet, what else did they have? I'm pregnant, she said. The words came out before she'd consciously decided to say them, but sitting there, looking at this man who'd just run into a burning building to save animals that weren't even his, Marin realized she couldn't keep it secret anymore. Jace's eyes went wide. His notebook fell from his hands, clattering to the floor. He just stared at her. I've known for about a week, Marin continued. Wasn't sure how to tell you. With everything happening with Mercer, it seemed like the wrong time. But there's probably never a right time, and you should know. Jace still hadn't moved. His expression was completely unreadable. If you're angry, Marin started, or if you think it's too soon, or... He stood abruptly and crossed to her, pulling her up from her chair and into his arms. He held her so tightly she could barely breathe, his whole body shaking. When he finally released her enough to grab his notebook, his handwriting was nearly illegible with emotion. Not angry, terrified, happy, overwhelmed. How are you? Are you all right? Should you have been helping with the horses? What if something had happened? I'm fine. We're fine. I didn't know what was going to happen at the barn, but I couldn't let you go in alone. You could have told me. I would have made you stay in the wagon. Exactly. That's why I didn't tell you. Jace looked like he wanted to argue, but instead he just pulled her close again and held on. That night they lay in bed, Jace's hand resting carefully on Marin's stomach, as if he could already feel the life growing there. I'm scared, Marin whispered into the darkness. I don't know how to be a mother. I don't know if I'll be any good at it. She felt Jace's hand move to his notebook. The scratch of pencil in the dark. Then he held it up to the window where moonlight made the words barely visible. You didn't know how to be a frontier wife either. You learned. You'll learn this too. We both will. What if something goes wrong? What if I can't? His hand covered her mouth gently. Then more writing. Stop borrowing trouble. We have enough real problems without inventing new ones. For tonight, just be happy. We survived today. We made peace with our enemy. We're going to have a child. Those are good things. Let them be good. Marin nodded against his hand. He was right. For once, just for tonight, she could let herself be happy without waiting for the other shoe to drop. The next weeks passed in a strange new rhythm. The burns healed slowly, leaving scars that Marin traced sometimes in idle moments, physical proof of the day everything changed. Word spread through the territory about what had happened at Mercer's ranch. The story grew with each telling until Marin and Jace were being credited with heroic acts they hadn't actually performed. Mercer himself stayed true to his word. The land claim disappeared. More than that, he stopped by the farm one afternoon with a gift, a breeding pair of pigs that would have cost Jace 6 months of savings. For your trouble, Mercer said gruffly. And because that child will need to eat. News of the pregnancy had spread as quickly as news of the fire. Small communities didn't keep secrets well. After Mercer left, Jace wrote, I don't trust him completely, but I think we might actually have peace. For now, Marin said, we'll take it. The pregnancy progressed through late summer into fall. Marin's body changed in new ways, and for the first time in her life, those changes felt like something other than shame. She was growing a child. Her body was doing exactly what it was supposed to do. The work didn't stop just because she was pregnant. If anything, there was more to do, preparing for winter, putting up food, making sure they had enough supplies to last through months of isolation. But Ruth stopped by frequently, teaching Marin what she needed to know about childbirth on the frontier where doctors were scarce and help was uncertain. You'll be fine, Ruth said one afternoon while showing Marin how to prepare the supplies they'd need. Your body's built for this. Strong women have strong babies. It was perhaps the kindest thing anyone had ever said about Marin's size. Winter came early that year, arriving in October with a vicious storm that lasted 3 days and left everything buried in snow. The isolation Jace had warned about became real. For weeks at a time, they saw no one except each other. The nearest neighbor was too far to visit, the town completely inaccessible until the roads cleared. Marin discovered that isolation with Jace was nothing like the isolation she'd felt in Philadelphia, surrounded by people. This was chosen, shared, purposeful. They worked together to keep the animals alive, to maintain the house, to survive each day. At night, they huddled close against the cold, and Jace would put his hand on her growing belly, and they'd feel the baby move together. He started talking to the baby, not with his voice, obviously, but with his notebook. He'd write little messages and read them aloud in his mind, his lips moving silently while his hand rested on Marin's stomach. Today, the temperature dropped to 15 below. Your mother insisted on checking the chickens herself, even though I told her I could do it. She's stubborn. You'll need to remember that. The first time I saw your mother, she was stepping off a train looking terrified and determined at the same time. I thought she'd get back on that train within a week. I'm glad I was wrong. I hope you have your mother's courage and your father's patience. Though if you end up with her stubbornness and my silence, We might all be in trouble. Marin would listen to these one-sided conversations and feel something warm bloom in her chest. This strange, quiet man who communicated in written words was going to be a father. They were going to be parents together. In late November, Marin woke in the middle of the night to pain lancing through her abdomen. At first she thought it was false labor. Ruth had warned her about that. But the pains continued, growing stronger and more regular. The baby was coming 2 months early. She shook Jace awake and saw immediate understanding in his eyes. He was out of bed instantly, lighting lamps, gathering the supplies Ruth had helped them prepare. The labor lasted 18 hours. There was no doctor, no help except Jace, and the instructions Ruth had drilled into them both. Marin had never experienced pain like this, relentless, consuming, beyond anything she'd imagined. Jace stayed with her through all of it. When she screamed, he held her hand. When she was too exhausted to continue, he wrote encouragement and showed it to her again and again. "You can do this. You're the strongest person I know. Just a little more. Stay with me." The baby was born as the sun rose, tiny and wrinkled and barely moving. "Why isn't she crying?" Marin gasped. "She should be crying." Jace worked frantically, doing everything Ruth had taught them, clearing the baby's mouth and nose, rubbing her skin to stimulate breathing. For a terrible moment, nothing happened. Then the baby gasped, coughed, and let out a thin, reedy wail. Marin started crying. Jace was crying too, silent tears streaming down his face as he wrapped their daughter in clean cloth and placed her carefully in Marin's arms. She was so small, too small. Born too early in a place with no medical help, in the middle of winter where any complication could be fatal. But she was alive, and she was theirs. Jace wrote with shaking hands, "She's beautiful. She's perfect. What should we name her?" Marin looked down at the tiny face, at eyes that were trying to focus on this new, cold world. "Sarah," she said, "after my mother." Jace nodded and wrote the name carefully in his notebook, as if recording it made it official. The first weeks were terrifying. Sarah was too small, too fragile. She had trouble feeding, trouble staying warm. Marin barely slept, checking constantly to make sure the baby was still breathing. Jace took over everything else, all the farm work, all the cooking, all the maintenance. He'd come in from the cold every few hours to check on them both, his face lined with worry. On the 10th day, Sarah stopped breathing in the middle of the night. Marin woke to a silence that was wrong and found her daughter limp and blue. She screamed for Jace, who came running and took the baby from her hands. He'd helped birth calves that weren't breathing, foals that needed stimulation to survive. He applied the same desperate techniques now, rubbing Sarah's chest, clearing her airway, breathing gently into her tiny mouth. For an eternity that probably lasted 30 seconds, nothing happened. Then Sarah gasped and started crying, a sound that was the most beautiful thing Marin had ever heard. Jace handed her back to Marin and then collapsed against the wall, his whole body shaking with reaction. He didn't write anything. There were no words for what they'd just experienced. Marin held Sarah close and rocked her and cried until she had no tears left. After that night, something shifted. Sarah grew stronger, feeding better, staying warmer. The crisis point had passed. She was still tiny, still fragile, but she was fighting to survive. Winter continued its siege, but inside the small house there was warmth and life. Marin would sit by the fire, nursing Sarah while Jace worked on small repairs or read from one of the few books they owned. Sometimes he'd write little observations and show them to Marin. "She has your eyes. I think she smiled at me today. Ruth says babies that young don't smile, but I know what I saw. She's going to be stubborn like you. I can already tell." In mid-December, the weather cleared enough for Ruth to visit. She examined Sarah thoroughly and pronounced her healthy, if small. "You two did good," Ruth said. "Premature birth in the middle of winter with no help. Most babies wouldn't make it. But she's a fighter." She looked at Marin. "Like her mother." After Ruth left, Jace wrote, "We made it. Through Mercer's threats, through the fire, through the hardest winter I've seen, through early labor with no doctor. We made it." "We made it," Marin agreed, so looking down at Sarah sleeping in her arms. They'd built something real here. Not perfect, not easy, but real. A marriage based on partnership and respect, a farm that was slowly becoming prosperous, a daughter who'd defied the odds to survive. Marin thought about the woman who'd stepped off that train 5 months ago, terrified, desperate, certain she'd fail. That woman had been so afraid of being too much, of taking up too much space, of being too visible. She'd become someone different now, someone stronger, someone who ran into burning buildings and broke into houses and stood up to powerful men and survived childbirth in the wilderness. Someone who'd finally found a place where being too much was exactly enough. Spring arrived like an apology, melting the snow in great rushing streams and turning the frozen ground to mud. Sarah was 4 months old now, still small, but thriving in a way that made those terrifying first weeks feel like a distant nightmare. She'd developed a personality, loud when hungry, stubborn when tired, curious about everything her unfocused eyes could see. Jace was completely devoted to her. He'd rigged up a sling so he could carry her while doing chores, her tiny head bobbing against his chest as he fed chickens or repaired fences. Marin would watch them from the house and feel something she'd never expected to feel: complete. Not perfect. Their life was still hard, still uncertain, still full of work that never ended, but complete in a way that mattered. The farm had survived the winter better than expected. They'd lost only 2 chickens and 1 goat, which Ruth assured them was remarkably good. The vegetable garden, damaged by last summer's flood, was being replanted with help from seeds Ruth had saved from her own harvest. "You're going to have a good year," Ruth predicted one afternoon, watching Marin work the soil while Sarah slept in a basket nearby. "The land's recovering, you're both stronger, and people are starting to respect what you've built here." "Are they?" Marin asked. She hadn't been to town in months, too focused on surviving winter and keeping Sarah alive to care about what anyone thought. "Margaret mentions you every time I go to the store. Says you're the talk of the territory, the city woman who didn't run, who stood up to Mercer, who helped save his horses. They're calling you brave." Marin snorted. "They called me fat and desperate 6 months ago." "People are allowed to change their minds when you prove them wrong," Ruth said mildly. "You did that. Be proud of it." But pride felt complicated. Marin was glad they'd survived, glad Sarah was healthy, glad the farm was improving, but she couldn't forget the judgmental stares when she'd first arrived, the whispered insults, the certainty in everyone's eyes that she would fail. Proving them wrong felt good. It just didn't erase the fact that they'd been so quick to judge in the first place. When Jace came in for lunch, he found Marin sitting at the table staring at nothing. He set Sarah's basket down carefully and wrote, "What's wrong?" "Ruth says people are talking about us, calling us brave. And that bothers you?" "It bothers me that they needed us to almost die before they decided we were worth respecting. Why couldn't they just treat us decently from the start?" Jace sat down across from her and wrote for a long time. "Because people are afraid of what they don't understand. You're a woman who doesn't apologize for taking up space. I'm a man who can't speak. Together we don't fit anyone's idea of how life should work." That scared them. When you're scared of something, it's easier to judge it than understand it. But then we didn't fail. We didn't disappear. We didn't give them the satisfaction of proving their prejudices right. So now they have to reconsider. Some of them will, some won't. All we can control is how we live, not how they react to it. Marin read it twice. "When did you get so wise?" Years of being judged teaches you things. Either you internalize it and break, or you learn to stop caring what people think and just live. I chose the second option. Took me a long time, though. "I'm still working on it," Marin admitted. "You'll get there. You're already further along than you think." That afternoon, they decided to make the trip to town. They needed supplies, and it was time to stop hiding from other people's opinions. Sarah was bundled into blankets and settled between them on the wagon seat, her eyes wide with fascination at this new experience of movement and open sky. The town looked the same as always, rough, unfinished, populated by people trying to survive in a place that didn't make survival easy. But something felt different this time. People who saw them didn't immediately look away or whisper. A few even nodded greeting. At the general store, Margaret's face lit up when they entered. "Marin, Jace, and this must be Sarah. Oh, let me see her." Marin carefully transferred Sarah into Margaret's experienced arms, watching as the older woman cooed over the baby with genuine delight. "She's beautiful," Margaret said. "Small, but clearly a fighter, just like her mother. Other customers in the store came over to see the baby. Women who'd ignored Maren 6 months ago now asked questions about the birth, about how Sarah was feeding, about whether Maren needed any help or advice. It was surreal. Jace was gathering supplies when Thomas Mercer entered the store. The conversation died immediately. Everyone watched to see what would happen. Mercer approached slowly, his expression uncertain. Calder. Mrs. Calder. I heard you had the baby. We did, Maren said carefully. Her name is Sarah. May I? Mercer gestured toward the baby in Margaret's arms. Maren nodded, and Margaret carefully transferred Sarah to Mercer's awkward hold. He looked down at the tiny face with something that might have been regret. My daughter was born premature too, he said quietly. 23 years ago, she didn't make it past the first week. The doctor said there was nothing we could do. She was just too small, born too early. My wife never forgave me for not being able to save her. He handed Sarah back to Margaret with careful gentleness. I'm glad your daughter survived, he continued, and I'm glad you both survived the winter. I hear it was hard. It was, Maren said, but we managed. Mercer nodded. If you need anything, supplies, help, whatever, you come to me. I owe you more than I can repay for what you did at the barn, but I can at least make sure you don't go without necessities. It was the closest thing to friendship Mercer would probably ever offer. Maren decided to accept it for what it was. Thank you, she said. We'll remember that. After Mercer left, the store erupted in whispered conversations. Maren caught fragments. Never seen him like that. Actually being decent. Those two changed him somehow. Jace caught her eye and raised his eyebrows. Maren shrugged. They hadn't set out to change anyone. They'd just tried to survive with some measure of integrity intact. If that had somehow transformed their worst enemy into something resembling an ally, she'd take it. They loaded their supplies and started the journey home. Sarah fell asleep in Maren's arms, exhausted by all the new faces and sounds. The sun was warm on Maren's face, the breeze gentle, and for the first time in months, she felt something close to peace. I think we're going to be all right, she said to Jace. He nodded and reached over to squeeze her hand. Summer brought new challenges. The heat was intense, and the work was relentless. Sarah was growing, becoming more active and demanding more attention. Maren learned to balance farming with motherhood, strapping Sarah to her back while she worked in the garden, nursing her in whatever shade could be found during the worst of the afternoon heat. Jace expanded the farm, building a new chicken coop and adding fencing for the pigs Mercer had given them. The pigs had produced a litter of 6 piglets, which meant more work, but also more future income. One evening in late July, exactly 1 year after Maren had arrived in Tanner's Creek, they sat on the porch watching the sunset. Sarah was asleep in her basket, the animals were settled for the night, and the day's work was finally done. Jace pulled out his notebook and wrote, 1 year ago today you got off that train. Did you ever imagine we'd end up here? Here specifically? No. Married to you with a baby and a working farm? Definitely not. I thought I'd probably be back in Philadelphia within a month, admitting defeat and listening to Catherine tell me I told you so. What changed your mind? What made you stay after that first week when everything was terrible? Maren thought about it. You did. The way you didn't pity me or try to change me. The way you expected me to work hard but didn't expect me to be perfect. The way you communicated more with your silence than most people do with 1,000 words. You made me feel like I could be enough exactly as I was. Jace's eyes were bright in the fading light. He wrote, You saved me too. I was drowning here alone. Going through motions but not really living. You gave me a reason to build something that mattered instead of just surviving. We saved each other then, Maren said. Yes, we did. They sat in comfortable silence until the stars came out, and neither of them felt the need to say anything more. August brought visitors. Catherine arrived unannounced, stepping off the same train Maren had arrived on a year earlier. She looked exactly as Maren remembered, perfectly dressed, perfectly coiffed, with the same pinched expression of perpetual dissatisfaction. Maren was in town picking up supplies when she saw her sister on the platform, looking around with barely concealed distaste. Catherine, Maren said, startled, what are you doing here? Catherine turned, her eyes going wide when she saw Marin. Good heavens, is that really you? Marin looked down at herself, work dress faded and patched, hands calloused and strong, body still large but muscular now in a way it never had been in Philadelphia. She probably looked like exactly what she was, a frontier farmer who worked hard for everything she had. It's me, she said. Why are you here? I came to see if you were still alive, Catherine said. You haven't written in months. I thought perhaps you'd died or run off or… She stopped, clearly uncomfortable. Or failed and was too ashamed to admit it? Catherine's silence was answer enough. I've been busy, Marin said. Running a farm and raising a baby doesn't leave much time for letters. A baby? Catherine's voice went sharp. You had a baby. When? Why didn't you tell me? In November. And I didn't tell you because I've been focused on keeping her alive through a frontier winter, not on maintaining correspondence with family who made it clear they didn't want me around. Catherine flinched. That's not fair. Isn't it? You measured my food, Catherine. Your husband complained about the cost of my existence. You both made it very clear I was a burden you couldn't wait to be rid of. So I left, and I built a life that doesn't require me to apologize for existing. I was trying to help you, Catherine protested. You were never going to find a husband looking like… She stopped, but the damage was done. Looking like what? Marin asked quietly. Say it. Like I'm fat? Like I'm too big? Like I'm not pretty enough or small enough or acceptable enough for polite society? I know what you thought, Catherine. I've always known. I just wanted you to have a good life. No, you wanted me to have a life that didn't embarrass you. There's a difference. Marin picked up the supply crate Jace had loaded into the wagon earlier. I do have a good life now. A husband who respects me, a daughter who's healthy, a farm that's thriving, friends who value what I contribute. I don't need to be smaller or quieter or less to deserve those things. I just needed to find people who understood that. Catherine looked like she'd been slapped. Can I at least meet the baby? My niece? Marin hesitated, then nodded. Follow me. The ride back to the farm was silent and awkward. Catherine stared at the landscape with obvious horror. The vast emptiness, the rough roads, the complete absence of civilization as she understood it. When the farm came into view, her expression suggested she'd expected worse, but was still disappointed. Jace was in the yard working on repairing a wagon wheel. He looked up as they approached, his eyes questioning when he saw Catherine. This is my sister, Marin said. Catherine, this is my husband, Jace. Catherine's eyes went wide when Jace didn't respond verbally. He doesn't speak? No. He communicates just fine without it. Jace had already pulled out his notebook. Welcome to our home. Marin has mentioned you. Catherine read the note, and her expression flickered through several emotions Marin couldn't quite identify. Pity, perhaps, or discomfort at having her prejudices confirmed. Where's the baby? Catherine asked. Sarah was inside, recently fed and dozing in her basket. Marin led Catherine into the house and carefully lifted her daughter, holding her out for Catherine to see. Catherine's face softened immediately. Whatever else she was, she'd always loved children. Oh, she's tiny. Was she early? 2 months. It was difficult. I can imagine. Out here with no doctor, no help. Catherine stopped, shook her head. You must have been terrified. I was. But Jace was with me, and Ruth, our neighbor, had prepared us as well as anyone could. We managed. Catherine reached out tentatively, and Marin let her hold Sarah. The baby woke, looked up at this new face with solemn confusion, then decided it was acceptable and went back to sleep. She has your eyes, Catherine said quietly, and your stubborn chin. Yes, she's going to be a handful. They sat at the small kitchen table while Marin made tea. The silence stretched uncomfortably until Catherine finally spoke. I came here to convince you to come home, she admitted. I thought you'd be miserable, desperate to leave. I was going to offer you your room back, tell you we'd been too harsh, give you another chance. She looked around the small, simple house. But you're not miserable, are you? No, Marin said. I'm not. You're actually happy here, in this tiny house, in the middle of nowhere, married to a man who can't speak, doing back-breaking work every day. You're genuinely happy. I am. Catherine was quiet for a long moment. Then, I don't understand it, but I can see it's true. You look different, stronger, more confident, like you finally fit in your own skin. I do fit, Marin said. For the first time in my life, I actually fit. Catherine stayed for 3 days. She was useless at farm work and uncomfortable with the primitive conditions, but she tried. She held Sarah when Marin needed both hands for chores. She attempted to cook dinner one night, burning it spectacularly, but earning a rare smile from Jace for the effort. She even tried milking the cow, though the cow had other ideas and sent her sprawling in the mud. On the third evening, sitting on the porch while Jace played with Sarah inside, Catherine finally said what she'd come to say. I'm sorry for how I treated you in Philadelphia, for making you feel like you were too much, like you needed to be smaller to deserve love. I thought I was helping, but I was just trying to make you fit into a world that was too small for you. You needed a bigger world. You found it. Marin felt tears prick her eyes. Thank you. That means more than you know. I also need to tell you something else. Catherine took a breath. Richard and I are separating. My husband. We're separating. What? Why? Because I realize that I've spent 15 years married to a man who values money more than people, who sees everyone as either useful or burdensome. I watched you leave everything familiar and build something real with a man who can't even speak, and I realized I've been settling for so much less than I deserve. Catherine smiled sadly. You inspired me, Marin. You showed me that it's possible to choose dignity over comfort. They sat together in the gathering darkness, two sisters who'd spent most of their lives not understanding each other, finally finding common ground. When Catherine left the next morning, she hugged Marin tightly. Write to me, please. I want to know how Sarah grows up. I want to be part of your life if you'll let me. I will, Marin promised, but only if you stop trying to fix me. Deal, Catherine said, and there were tears on her face as the train pulled away. Fall arrived with its usual urgency, demanding that everything be prepared for winter before the snow came. This year, Marin and Jace were ready. They'd learned from last year's mistakes. The root cellar was fully stocked. The animals had shelter that wouldn't leak. They had enough firewood to last 6 months. Sarah had her first birthday in November, celebrated with a simple cake that Marin made from precious hoarded sugar and Ruth's gift of preserved berries. The baby smeared frosting everywhere and laughed with delight at the mess. And Jace took a dozen notes documenting every moment because he couldn't bear to forget a single detail. Winter came again, but this time it felt less like a siege and more like a season to be weathered. They'd survived one winter. They could survive another. During the long, dark evenings, Jace started teaching Sarah to communicate in the way he'd learned to communicate, through gestures and expressions. She was too young to understand, but he was patient. He'd point to objects and make signs, waiting for the day she'd sign back. You really think she'll learn? Marin asked one night, watching him work with Sarah. He wrote, She'll learn what she needs to learn. If she can speak out loud, wonderful. If she can't, or chooses not to, she'll still have ways to communicate. I'll make sure of that. You're going to be an amazing father, Marin said. I'm terrified every day that I'll fail her, that my silence will handicap her somehow, make her life harder than it needs to be. Your silence isn't a handicap. It's just a different way of being. She'll learn that, and she'll be stronger for it. Jace looked at her with such gratitude and love that Marin felt her breath catch. They'd come so far from that first awkward meeting on the train platform, from strangers gambling on a desperate arrangement to partners who trusted each other completely, from people trying to survive to people building a life worth living. Spring came again, bringing with it the news that Thomas Mercer had suffered a stroke. He survived, but it left him partially paralyzed and unable to manage his vast holdings. His wife, surprisingly, took control and immediately began making changes, treating workers better, negotiating fairer contracts, slowly transforming the Mercer empire into something less predatory. I never liked how Thomas ran things, she told Marin during a visit. But he wouldn't listen to me. Now he doesn't have a choice. And I find I'm rather good at this. The territory was changing. More families were arriving, drawn by the promise of cheap land and new opportunities. A school opened in Tanner's Creek, taught by a young woman from Boston who'd come west for adventure. Ruth suggested that Marin might want to send Sarah to school when she was old enough. "She'll need education," Ruth said, "and friends her own age. The frontier's no place to grow up completely isolated." Marin agreed, though the thought of Sarah being old enough for school seemed impossibly far away. She was only 18 months old, just learning to walk and starting to form words. Her first word, predictably, was mama. Her second word surprised everyone, da. Jace had been so certain Sarah would learn to communicate through signs that he'd almost stopped hoping she'd speak aloud. When she pointed at him and clearly said da, he sat down hard in his chair and cried. Marin knelt beside him and wrote in his notebook for him, since his hands were shaking too hard. "She knows you're her father. She knows you matter. Your silence didn't stop her from loving you." 2 years after Marin's arrival, the farm was unrecognizable from the struggling homestead it had been. They'd expanded the crops, the animals had multiplied, and they were actually turning a profit. Small, but real. Jace built an addition to the house, a second bedroom for Sarah, and a workspace where Marin could work on the sewing she'd started doing for other families in the area. Her skills with needle and thread, learned during those boarding house years, had become a valuable source of extra income. People came to them now for advice, new homesteaders who'd heard stories about the silent farmer and his wife, who'd survived everything the frontier threw at them. Jace would demonstrate techniques for building and farming. Marin would share what she'd learned about preserving food and managing supplies through long winters. They'd become respected members of the community without ever trying to be. They'd just lived their lives with integrity and competence, and respect had followed naturally. One evening in late summer, exactly 3 years after Marin had stepped off that train, they sat on their porch watching Sarah play in the yard. She was chasing chickens with the determined focus only a 2-year-old could muster, laughing when they scattered away from her grasping hands. "Do you ever miss Philadelphia?" Jace wrote. "Never," Marin said immediately. "Do you ever regret advertising for a wife?" "Only when you make me eat your experimental cooking. Remember the bean soup incident?" Marin laughed. She'd been trying a new recipe and somehow managed to make it both burned and undercooked simultaneously. Even the pigs had refused to eat it. That was one time. One memorable time. They sat in comfortable silence until Sarah ran up to the porch, demanding water and attention in equal measure. Marin scooped her up and Sarah immediately started chattering about the chickens and the garden and a butterfly she'd seen. Jace watched them both with an expression of such contentment that Marin felt her heart swell. This was what mattered. Not what they'd escaped, not what they'd overcome, not what people thought of them. Just this. A family sitting together at the end of a long day, safe and fed and together. "Tell me something," Marin said to Jace. "If you could go back to that day you wrote the advertisement, knowing everything that would happen, the struggles, the threats, the fire, the difficult winter, all of it, would you still do it?" Jace didn't even reach for his notebook. He just looked at Sarah, then at Marin, and nodded emphatically. Then he wrote, "Every single thing we went through led us here. To this moment. To this family. To this life. I wouldn't change a single thing." Marin understood completely. She'd arrived in Tanner's Creek convinced she was taking the coward's way out, running from rejection toward an uncertain future. She'd thought she was giving up on ever being truly happy. Instead, she'd found something she hadn't even known to look for. Not just acceptance, but belonging. Not just survival, but purpose. Not just a husband, but a true partner. Not just a house, but a home. The sun was setting, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and gold. Sarah had fallen asleep in Marin's lap, exhausted from her day of chasing chickens and exploring her small world. Jace reached over and took Marin's free hand, threading his fingers through hers. They'd built this together, a life that hadn't existed 3 years ago. A family forged from desperation and determination and a shared refusal to let the world tell them they weren't good enough. In a place where only the strong survived, they'd done more than survive. They'd proven that strength came in forms people didn't expect, that silence could communicate more than words, that bodies came in all sizes and all of them were capable of incredible things, that love didn't require perfection, just persistence and mutual respect. They'd changed the rules simply by refusing to play by them, and sitting there on their porch, watching the sun set over land they'd worked with their own hands, holding the daughter they'd fought to keep alive, Marin finally understood something she'd been searching for her entire life. She was enough. She'd always been enough. She just needed to find the right place to prove it. Jace squeezed her hand gently, and she squeezed back. A silent conversation that said everything that needed saying. Tomorrow would bring more work, more challenges, more tests of their resilience. Winter would come again, crops might fail, animals might die, new threats might emerge, but they'd face it all together, the way they'd faced everything else. And they'd keep winning, not because they were perfect or lucky or specially blessed, but because they were too stubborn to accept anything less than the life they'd fought so hard to build. The stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky. Sarah stirred in her sleep, mumbling something about chickens. Jace smiled and Marin smiled back. This was their story. Not the one anyone had expected them to write, but the one they'd earned through blood and sweat and refusing to quit when quitting would have been so much easier. A story that started with a desperate choice and ended with a life worth living. A story that proved once and for all that the rules about who deserved happiness and success and love were written by people who'd never had to fight for any of those things, and that the strongest people weren't the ones who followed those rules. They were the ones who had the courage to break them.